Hi, everyone, and welcome to Café IBTTA. I'm Pat Jones, and my guest today is Mike Heiligenstein. He's the Executive Director of the Central Texas Regional Mobility Authority. Mike was the first employee of the RMA back in 2002, and under Mike's leadership, the Mobility Authority has delivered 6 projects totaling more than 230 lane miles. Open to the public, with another 155 lane miles under construction. Mike served as president of IBTTA in 2014 and hosted us for our 2014 annual meeting, as he's going to do this year for our 2020 annual meeting, fingers crossed. So
Yeah.
Mike, welcome to Cafe IBTTA. It's great to have you here.
Well, thank you, Pat. I appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity to visit with you. This is such a great format for our members and for those watching. I think it's just nice to be able to communicate in this world where communication has gotten so difficult. But thank you.
Well, thanks for being here. And you've really touched upon the theme of Cafe IBTTA. We strive for content that's interesting, relevant, uplifting, and fun. And Mike, in a couple of minutes, I'm going to ask you about toll road financing and driver behavior in the wake of COVID-19. But first, I want to start with something else. I want to talk about briefly the death of George Floyd and systemic racism in our country. You know, it's a little uncomfortable and awkward for me to talk about this. I feel like I'm probably going to put my foot in my mouth and offend some people, but I think the worst sin is not to talk about it at all. People are hurting in this country, people are suffering, people are dying. We talked about the situation at our staff meeting on Monday, and there were tears in people's eyes. And Tracy Brown, who's an expert in bringing people together for conversations and talking about unconscious bias, she led a workshop, Women in Tolling workshop and virtual meeting on Monday called Bias, Hiding in Plain Sight. And one of the things she said to us is that if people can't talk about things that are happening in the world, in their own workplaces, then something's wrong. We need to be able to and allowed to talk about these things, these important issues in the workplace. I would remind people as we get into this that there's a chat function on your screen, and you can ask questions at any time, and we'll get to those questions. But first, you know, we've seen the protests and the demonstrations all around the country and around the world. In my experience, we haven't seen a moment like this since the 1960s. Many people have made statements about what's happening and about systemic racism in America in recent days. I want to read a statement from President George W. Bush that especially resonated with me. Here goes. Laura and I are anguished by the brutal suffocation of George Floyd and disturbed by the injustice and fear that suffocate our country. Yet we have resisted the urge to speak out because this is not the time for us to lecture. It is a time for us to listen. It is time for America to examine our tragic failures. And as we do, we will also see some of our redeeming strengths. It remains a shocking failure that many African Americans, especially young African American men, are harassed and threatened in their own country. It is a strength when protesters, protected by responsible law enforcement, march for a better future. This tragedy, in a long series of similar tragedies, raises a long overdue question. How do we end systemic racism in our society? The only way to see ourselves in a true light is to listen to the voices of so many who are hurting and grieving. Those who set out to silence those voices do not understand the meaning of America or how it becomes a better place. America's greatest challenge has long been to unite people of very different backgrounds into a single nation of justice and opportunity. The doctrine and habits of racial superiority, which once nearly split our country, still threaten our union. The answers to American problems are found by living up to American ideals, to the fundamental truth that all human beings are created equal and endowed by God with certain rights. We have often underestimated how radical that quest really is and how our cherished principles challenge systems of intended or assumed injustice. The heroes of America, from Frederick Douglass to Harriet Tubman to Abraham Lincoln to Martin Luther King Jr., are heroes of unity. Their calling has never been for the faint-hearted. They often revealed the nation's disturbing bigotry and exploitation, stains on our character, sometimes difficult for the American majority to examine. We can only see the reality of America's need, by seeing it through the eyes of the threatened, oppressed, and disenfranchised. That is exactly where we now stand. Many doubt the justice of our country, and with good reason. Black people see the repeated violation of their rights without an urgent and adequate response from American institutions. We know that lasting justice will only come by peaceful means. Looting is not liberation, and destruction is not progress. But we also know that lasting peace in our communities requires truly equal justice. The rule of law ultimately depends on the fairness and legitimacy of the legal system. And achieving justice for all is the duty of all. This will require a consistent, courageous, and creative effort. We serve our neighbors best when we try to understand their experience. We love our neighbors as ourselves when we treat them as equals in both protection and compassion. There is a better way, the way of empathy and shared commitment and bold action, and a peace rooted in justice. I am confident that together, Americans will choose the better way. So that was the statement issued by President George W. Bush yesterday. I read it because it really resonated with me. They're words aimed at healing and reconciliation. They're also words that propel us to action. We have a lot of work to do in our country to end systemic racism. And I hope we can all listen to one another and take action. So, Mike, I know you have some thoughts about this as well, and just want to hear your reflection on this.
Well, I can, having known George W., my career, political career, I can tell you he wrote that, and he meant it was from his heart. And he's very a thoughtful president. I would say that he didn't always get treated fairly sometimes, but he was a very thoughtful man. And I think if we had more voices like that, perhaps we would get past this faster. And I look forward to some of our leadership stepping forward with similar thoughts and actions. Let's back it up with action.
Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, you're welcome, Pat. Thank you for bringing that up.
You know, I know there's a strong history of elective office and public service in your family, and I notice there's a picture over your shoulder there. Maybe
Yeah, right.
that looks like it could be one of your relatives. Would you tell us about that?
Yeah, that's my dad. He was a county official, elected county board member up in Illinois, where I grew up, and he held a seat that ended up being in the family until last year for 97 years. My great-grandfather, grandfather, dad, they all felt very strongly about participatory democracy, and they did it for the right reasons. And our family goes back to the time of Lincoln in the state of Illinois, and I think I'm very proud of that.
Now, Mike, you also have been in elective office in your life. You've carried on that tradition. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, when I came out of the University of Texas, or as we say, the University of Texas, for all those Aggies out there, I finished with a master's in government and really felt like that was my calling to teach. And so I wanted to go the academic route and the elective. I thought the two really would make a great combination. So in 1980, I was elected to a city council position. And then in 1989 to a county commissioner in Texas. And so I held office for 23 years. So I was probably 6 or 8 elections that I went through. That's like having an interview with 50,000 people every 4 years. So anyway, it was a great experience for me, and it was an area that was growing, which kind of segued me into infrastructure because of all the needs we had on water, sewer, streets, drainage, everything. I participated in water infrastructure was my first foray, and then wastewater for regional wastewater, and then highways and roads and transportation. So yeah, it's been Texas was very good to a Yankee.
Good. That's great. That's great. Well, I would expect they would. You know, they have a very big and expansive feel about them.
That's right. Whenever somebody called me a Yankee, Pat, I'd tell them I was from Southern Illinois.
So, Mike, you were employee number one with the RMA, and since then you've grown the authority a great deal. Just give us a sense of the scope of what's involved with the CTRMA these days.
Well, it's interesting. I actually, back in the day, before I was even contacted to apply for the position like everybody else, I had, on a commissioner's court, had voted to create the authority. So I kind of went back even before being the first employee. But the RMA, back in that day, we were looking for regional solutions. We knew that each entity in and of itself couldn't solve the problems in the greater Austin, Central Texas area. We had looked at various proposals and combinations and ways to help bring together the needed capital to build the roads, which were at that time, hundreds of millions of dollars as opposed to billions. We knew that these projects were going to be expensive. Travis County, where the city of Austin is located, and Williamson County are very different counties, particularly at that time. One was a red county, one was a blue county. But we came together on a bipartisan level basis and said, this is too important to leave to chance. So we created the Regional Mobility Authority to propel us and to get us moving forward on financing of infrastructure, because frankly, our area in Texas, you have Houston, and then you have Dallas and Fort Worth that dominated the state and dominated funding. As an example, 150 state reps, probably 110 of them are from those two geographic areas. So you're going to be in the back of the line when it comes to funding. So we created this to get us to the front of the line and determine our own future, which is what we've done over the last 17 years.
So let's talk a little bit about the future. We know that the COVID-19 pandemic over the last several months has destroyed traffic all over the country and all over the world. And I know that one of your big concerns is understanding driver and commuter behavior. And we've had models for evaluating this in the past, but this is a whole new ballgame and a whole new world. Talk to me about driver and commuter behavior.
Well, I think that it may be the biggest challenge we have going forward is not what happens, but understanding it. We are engaged in actively surveying our customers and the people in our region to understand what going forward is going to be the next normal in terms of working from home and other mitigation efforts on the part of commuters. So we need to know that for a number of reasons. One of the layers is financing, future financing, particularly for express lanes, managed lanes. Very important. What will the capacity look like on the non-toll? See, we build, as I know, Denver, Atlanta, Carolinas, and other places, you're building express lanes, managed lanes next to non-tolled facilities. So what is the capacity level going to be in those non-tolled, and how are we going to predict what kind of indicative behavior do we need to be understanding going forward so we can explain to the credit markets how these projects still make sense, particularly given us, we're in a very rapidly growing area, and most people think it will remain that, as are some of the other areas I mentioned.
One of the challenges that we've talked about with a number of agencies, and we talked about it last week during a nationwide virtual press briefing, is the liquidity of agencies and the importance of that for maintaining creditworthiness. Talk to me a little bit about that, Mike.
Yeah, I think you and I, we were talking about that, and I kind of got into the weeds on that a little bit, but one of the things in our conversations, as most people, I would assume by now, have had conversations with their rating agencies, as well as some of their customer base, investors. And one of the things that really has helped us is that back in about 10, 12 years ago, given some prior experience, I didn't want this agency to suffer in a situation similar to this with a lack of liquidity. In other words, I wanted a year's worth of revenue being able to support our operations. And I never knew what that a year off would look like, or a year without revenue would look like. I just felt like someday it was going to happen. I always thought it would come through the legal system, somebody challenging legislation and then having it go through the courts and having to suspend tolling for some reason. But this popped up, of course, and so the credit agencies and the investor groups really think this our liquidity position of a year's worth of revenue to cover operations is critical. And for that matter, they have seen this as very beneficial. I think we all going forward need to pay attention to that and be careful about diversions, be careful about where our revenue streams are headed until we get out of this, and then go back to perhaps some past practices. I know I heard Mark Compton the other day on what Penn Pike is doing, trying to defer some of their payments. And I don't know how you don't ask that question right now.
Yeah. So Mike, and to the audience, I want to invite people to ask your questions. You can use the chat function. And we have a question already from Patty Ribstello with the Washington State DOT. And coincidentally, Patty's going to be our guest next week on Café IBTTA. Patty asks, Mike, what are you learning so far with the survey that you're doing?
We are doing what's called a panel survey, and what we're going to be doing is we want to get up to 10, 12, 15,000 people that we can send questions out to on a daily basis if necessary, or a weekly basis. I don't know if any of you watch Michael Shmerkanish on POTUS, but he does a question every day. And what we're finding is that a lot of we have Google, we have Facebook, we have a lot of those high-tech large corporations here, Dell Computer, who provide a lot of our income during peak hours. And we're finding that they don't plan to go back and forth until after the first of the year. And then at maybe 25%. And in Austin, a very, very hot office market for the past 10 years at least, there were probably 90% of the new office leases are under question, so to speak, in terms of whether or not they're going to be picked up. So there's a lot of reevaluation in the downtown core, and there's a lot of reevaluation throughout the corporate world as well as individuals. People will be working from home. And I think that's something we got to take into consideration. Even a drop, we've done some surveys in the past on odd days of holidays in Texas, in the region, and such as Texas Independence Day, which was a big day for Texans, and even with a 10% drop, you see a lot of pickup in capacity on our roadways. It doesn't take a 50, 60% drop.
Right.
So we need to keep our eyes on that.
Exactly. Here's, speaking of capacity and congestion and traffic coming back, Mary Jane O'Meara asks a question. Mike, do you think traffic will come back before public transportation? And if yes, will this cause more congestion in already congested cities? What do you think in the case of Austin?
I think that's a really good point, and I think the answer is yes. And I think that it's also going to hinder carpooling. We are big proponents of carpooling, even though it doesn't help our overall revenue. In fact, it should diminish it somewhat, but we think it's the right thing to do. We partner with our local transit agency on express buses in our express lanes. I would be very disappointed, but our transit agency is taking steps to ensure the highest levels of sanitation on that public transit. And I think we all are going to have to get comfortable at some point with getting back into the marketplace. This is going to last for a while. My concern is that it's going to raise our awareness about the flu season to the point where people stay home during the flu season. This has been around. I mean, we're going to have to adapt and hopefully get a vaccine soon. But after that vaccine, there'll be other issues. So I think our world going forward, we're going to have to take a look at how the federal level can help us. I've got a couple of ideas, Pat. I'm going to quickly share those with you and go to some more questions. One is gap funding. I think going forward on express lanes and managed lanes, there's going to be some gaps perhaps between what we can prove up in our revenue, particularly during this period of time. One of our consultants, which is a modeling consultant, they're not giving us one scenario anymore. They're giving us 4 scenarios, from the worst case to moderate case. And some of those worst cases look bad. We think that we'll be somewhere in the middle, not terrible, but not like we were. Point being, there might be some need for gap funding that could be in the next bill. Say you're short $100 million out of a $600 million project, we have a place to go. One other thing that would really be helpful is right now, the interest rates on tax exempt bonds are amazing. And right now, there's many of us out there that have bonds that we cannot refund and get to a lower rate because a couple of years ago, the advanced refunding of bonds was stripped out of our program. And so we can't do that right now. Reinstating that could lower the debt by hundreds of millions of dollars throughout the country for toll agencies. I really hope that Congress will take a look at that.
Yeah, I'm hoping they take a look at that as well. That the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee just released their new FAST Act reauthorization today, and I know Neil Gray and our outside lobbyist Kathy Ruffalo are going through that to see what provisions will affect you and all of our members.
Yeah,
Mike, here's a question from Farzan Ahmed, your colleague at Ohio Turnpike and Infrastructure Commission. Looking 20 to 30 years down the road, if transportation funding formulas change and all transportation is funded by road user fees instead of the gas tax for DOTs and tolls for us, what's the future of toll agencies?
that's a really good question. It's one that came up about 4 or 5 years ago when I was sitting through one of these vehicle miles traveled type conferences that we used to have every year, at least once or twice, and which has cooled off a little bit. But what would be the relevance of toll agencies? And I think, first of all, I think it's going to be a very slow process. I know there's some work out in Patty's area. There's a couple pilots going on around the country, but those pilots have been going on for 10 years. And it just seems like we're not getting a lot of traction. I think it's going to have to come from the federal level. They're going to have to decide whether they want to raise the gas tax or move to a user base, because going forward, I think it's going to be more difficult to fund public infrastructure through the state DOTs and regions without tolling. I think tolling is going to be a critical component, particularly when you throw in some of these mega projects. Let me give you a quick example real quick. We have a I-35 project in downtown Austin right now that is going to be $6 to $7 billion project. Right now, our MPO is trying to figure out where to cut $633 million out of the next, defer $633 million out of the next few years. Those are real projects that are going to get deferred. So instead of taking I-35 and making it toll managed lanes, which could have paid for a big part of that. They're doing it totally with tax dollars, which is, I think, a mistaken policy, and it doesn't help the entire state because we're pulling money out of the state coffers to focus on one project.
Yeah. Mike, here's a question about the RMA model from your friend Shannon Swank. Do you think the RMA model is something that other states should implement? If yes, what are the advantages you see to agencies outside of Texas?
I absolutely do, and thank you for that question, Shannon. I have made presentations all over the country, as Pat, you probably know. The last one was in Nashville, and Butch Healy was very kind to ask me to come and explain our model. And we met with the state DOT leadership, we met with the regional leadership, and we met with the private sector over the course of a day and a half. And all of them were like, man, we are 20 years behind you. Now, we thought we were 20 years behind everybody else in Austin because we let congestion get so terrible. But I think that the regional level and local level is really where it's going to be in the future. I think this tax burden that comes, the downside of all these stimulus programs is going to be the future tax burden on the federal level and the state level, and its dependence on sales tax and so forth. I think regional and local is where it's going to rest. I think it's really important that you have regional buy-in and local representation. And I think that's what leads you to the kinds of decisions that are almost like private sector. We are a public sector enterprise, and we act like it. And like we say in Texas, we get to eat what we shoot. We have to draw people. If we don't build it, even if we build it, they won't necessarily come. We've got to market.
All right, let's see. Last question, I think, or close to the last question. Bill Kramer says tolling was proclaimed dead by the Texas legislature a few years ago. Clearly, it is not. What do you say? What do you say to that? You got kind of a wild pendulum swinging over there.
Well, we do, and I would say that again, at the local and regional level, it's been pretty much left alone. The state DOT has been a great partner with us as best they can. We are actually building a major project in Austin where we're building 2 lanes of their roadway. So we're incorporating what they wanted in capacity into our contract, which is the reverse of a lot of situations. But I think that we just stay the course, we stay patient, and we be careful how we frame ourselves and make sure we make friends and not enemies.
Mike, when you were president in 2014, your theme as president was customers and collaboration. And you said customers because they're the foundation of our business. Without customers, we don't have a tolled highway, bridge, or tunnel. And collaboration because working with and through others is one of the keys to building and growing a successful business operation. Any further reflections on that 6 years down the road?
Well, I really think that still would be my mantra, would be customers. Let's keep our eyes focused on what we can do to better their lives, particularly now. I think that's really important. I think collaboration, particularly with the private sector and with other, all levels of government, bringing them together. Pat, the IBTTA founded the Platinum folks, and the collaboration that you and the leadership of IBTTA now are doing with our Platinum members is so critical. And that type of collaboration was exactly what I'm talking about, because we're going to get our great responses and answers from the private sector in so many cases because they see it on the front lines too, and they're working to a bottom line. I think that IBTTA evolved into that footprint and evolved into that model that very few agencies and associations, industry associations do. So my kudos to you and to the leadership of IBTTA over the years to bring the private sector home and to the agencies on a better basis. And I look forward to the next 2 conferences. Hopefully we have Austin I have to tell you, Austin's ready for you. And then Phoenix will certainly be another great opportunity.
Well, I'm looking forward to that as well. And Mike, I'm going to do a couple of promos and then we'll exchange final greetings. First of all, everybody, the Toll Excellence Award deadline is coming up. It's July 1. We want to hear about your great projects that demonstrate excellence and innovation and creativity in the tolling industry. And we have a new category where we're asking for people to talk about their responses to COVID-19. We encourage you to go to the events page of IBTTA. We're adding a lot of new virtual events every day. Also, under the membership category, take a look at our procurement calendar. We're trying to keep the procurement calendar fresh and ready. It's really helpful to our vendor and supplier members, and it also helps agency members determine when they should put things out. And then stay tuned for our new mentor program. You know that a big emphasis of our president, Samuel Johnson, is mentorship and a toll immersion program. We're going to be introducing a new mentor program very soon. So next week, our guest will be Patty Rubstello from the Washington State DOT. And Mike, I want to thank you for your tremendous service to the tolling industry, CTRMA, IBTTA over the years. It's been great to work with you, and thanks for being our guest on Café IBTTA today.
Well, I thank you, Pat, and as you probably already know, I'll be with you for several more months due to this. The search for new executive director has sort of been put on hold during this next quarter or two, so we'll see where it all ends up. Couldn't be in a better place.
All right, Mike, thanks again for joining us, and to everybody from IBTTA, thank you for joining us. We'll see you next week, next Wednesday with Patty Rubstello. Thanks, everybody.